For thousands of years, humans have looked into the sky and seen something, not always clearly, not always consistently, but often enough to leave a record, not just in stories, not just in myths, but in images. If you go back through the history of art, especially in Europe between the 1300s and the early 1700s, you begin to notice something strange. Scattered across religious paintings, embedded quietly in the background, are objects in the sky. Not stars, not clouds, not angels in any recognizable form, but shapes, contained, structured, and in many cases observed. One of the most compelling examples appears in a 15th century painting often attributed to the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, Madonna with Saint Giovannino. At first glance, it's exactly what you would expect from a Renaissance religious work. Mary sits in the foreground with the Christ child. The composition is balanced, peaceful, and familiar. But as your eye moves into the background, something changes. Over her shoulder, in the sky, there is an object. Small, dark, oval, not glowing dramatically, not dominating the scene, just present, and beneath it stands a man. He is not gesturing wildly, he is not kneeling, he is not looking away. He is staring directly at it. Even the dog at his feet is oriented upward. That detail matters, because it transforms the object from decoration into a subject. This is not just something in the sky. This is something being seen. If this image were shown without context to a modern audience, the interpretation would be immediate. A person observing an unidentified object in the sky. Now move forward roughly 200 years to a painting by Aert de Gelder, The Baptism of Christ. Here the object is no longer subtle. It dominates the sky above the scene, a circular form, clearly bounded, radiating light outward from a central source. This is not how clouds behave. This is not how atmospheric light behaves. The light does not diffuse randomly. It originates from a point. It expands outward, but the boundary holds. Inside that light, there is a dove, clearly signaling the presence of the Holy Spirit within Christian iconography. And that is how the painting is understood. As a divine moment, a heavenly presence, but visually, something else is happening. Because what the artist has created is not just a symbol, it is a structure, a contained source of energy in the sky. Remove the dove, and the image changes instantly. It becomes something that looks far less symbolic and far more object-like. Now go further back, to the mid-14th century, inside the Visoki Dechani monastery in what is now Kosovo. A fresco depicting the crucifixion. At either side of the sky, two objects appear. They are not circular, they are elongated, capsule-like, each one enclosing what appears to be a figure. They are angled, not static. They appear to be moving. For centuries, these have been interpreted as representations of the sun and the moon, a common motif in medieval Christian art. Celestial bodies personified, but when you look at them carefully, something doesn't quite align with that explanation. They are not symbolic faces floating in space. They are enclosed, directional, almost navigational. They do not simply exist, they behave. This is one of the earliest known examples where something in the sky is depicted not just as a symbol, but as a contained directional form. Around the same period, similar imagery appears elsewhere. In a medieval fresco in Georgia, at the Svetitskhovely Cathedral, two oval-shaped forms appear in the sky near the crucifixion scene. They are structured, defined, sometimes interpreted as emitting light or energy. Individually, each of these images can be explained, contextualized, absorbed into religious symbolism. But taken together, they begin to form a pattern. Across centuries of art, created by different artists in different regions, with no shared intention to depict technology, we see the same visual language emerge: objects in the sky, defined shapes, boundaries, interaction, observation. This raises a deeper question, not about what these artists believed, but about what they were trying to represent. Because before these paintings, there were texts. Ancient historians recorded things seen in the sky long before artists attempted to paint them. Roman accounts describe shields hovering over cities, phantom ships moving through the air, luminous objects appearing and disappearing. They were not described as machines, they were not described as engineered craft, but they were described as objects. And then there is a text that takes this even further, the Book of Enoch, an ancient work predating much of the formal biblical canon, describing beings known as the Watchers. According to the text, these beings descended from the heavens. They arrived on earth, they interacted with humanity, they brought knowledge of tools, of metallurgy, of the workings of the natural world. They taught men the secrets of heaven. To ancient readers, these were angels, fallen or otherwise, but the descriptions themselves are not purely symbolic. They describe arrival, presence, interaction, events. And this is where interpretation becomes complicated. Because the people writing these texts, the people painting these images, did not have the language we have today. They had no concept of advanced technology, no understanding of propulsion systems, aerospace engineering, or non-human intelligence in a scientific sense. So when they encountered something structured, something real, something that did not fit into their understanding of the natural world, they translated it. They placed it into the framework they had available, the divine, angels, messengers, watchers, but the forms themselves remained, a circle in the sky, a vessel of light, an object descending. There are moments where the imagery becomes even more precise, not just objects in the sky, but interaction. In a Renaissance painting known as the Annunciation with Saint Emilius, something unusual happens above the scene. High over the city, a circular form appears. It is not a cloud, it is not diffuse, it has a boundary, and from that boundary, a beam descends. Not a glow, not ambient light, a directed line, focused, controlled, it cuts through the space of the painting with intention, connecting the sky to a single point on earth. The subject of that beam is a woman. Mary, in traditional interpretation, this represents divine intervention, the moment the divine enters the human world. But visually, something else is happening. Because what we are looking at is not just symbolism, it is a source and a transmission, a contained object interacting with the ground below eye, and this introduces something new into the pattern, not just presence, but contact. In 1975, in Arizona, a group of forestry workers reported an encounter that would become one of the most widely discussed UAP cases in modern history. Among them was Travis Walton. According to multiple witnesses, they observed a structured object hovering above the ground. From that object, a beam of light emerged, directed, focused, striking Walton and lifting him off his feet. The men who witnessed the event fled the scene, believing they had just seen their co-worker killed. Walton would later reappear, days after the incident, with a story that would ignite decades of debate. What makes this case unusual is not just the claim itself, but the number of witnesses. Multiple individuals independently recounting the same sequence of events. And when tested, they all passed polygraph examinations. While no test is perfect and no account can be considered definitive proof, the consistency of the testimony and the number of people involved places this case among the more difficult to dismiss. And what connects it back to the image we've just seen is not the interpretation, but the structure. A contained object, a directed beam, an interaction between sky and human. Separated by centuries, described in completely different ways, but sharing the same underlying form, now shift from a single object to many. In a 16th century illustration from Basel, Switzerland, the sky is no longer empty, it is filled. Dozens of dark shapes appear above the city, circular, spherical, repeated. Not blended into the clouds, not part of the atmosphere. They are separate, discrete, and moving. The account that accompanies the image describes objects appearing in the sky, moving rapidly, interacting with one another, before eventually disappearing. This is not symbolic religious art. This is an attempt to document an event, And what is being documented is not one object, but many, which introduces another dimension entirely. If these are objects, then this is not a singular occurrence. It is a group, a presence that appears in numbers. At first glance, this scene appears familiar, a miracle, snow, falling in the middle of summer, a sign from the heavens, a moment of divine intervention. But then, your attention shifts, not to the figures below, but to the sky above them, because what fills the sky doesn't behave the way you expect. These are not soft, continuous forms. They are not blending into one another. They are separated, repeated, defined, each shape contained within its own boundary. Dozens of them spread across the sky in a way that feels deliberate, and that's where something changes, because what should read as atmosphere begins to read as structure, not a single phenomenon, but many. The traditional explanation is straightforward. These are stylized snowflakes, a visual way to represent a miraculous snowfall, and in that context, the image makes sense. But visually, the execution raises questions, because this is not how snow is typically painted. Snow is usually soft, diffuse, continuous. It fills space. It doesn't occupy it. But here, each form exists independently. They don't dissolve. They don't blur. They hold their shape, almost like objects, suspended in place. And when you step back and view the entire scene, the scale becomes impossible to ignore. This is not one object in the sky. This is many, which introduces a different kind of question. Not just what is being seen, but how many of them are there? And if there are many, then whatever is being depicted here is not isolated. It is repeated, and that changes everything. Because a single anomaly can always be explained away, but a sky filled with structure demands something more. Not necessarily an answer, but a deeper question about what these artists were trying to capture when they looked upward and chose to paint what they saw. Now shift to the present. In 2004, US Navy pilots encountered something over the Pacific Ocean that would become one of the most widely discussed UAP cases in modern history. Commander David Fravor described it as a white, tic-tac-shaped object. Featureless, smooth, no wings, no rotors, no visible propulsion. It hovered above the water. It moved with precision. It accelerated at speeds and in ways that defied known physics. It behaved like a controlled object, not a cloud, not a natural phenomenon, an object. And for the first time in modern history, these encounters are not being dismissed outright. Members of the United States Congress have acknowledged that unidentified aerial phenomena are real, that they are being observed by trained military personnel, that they remain unexplained. Some have even suggested that ancient texts like the Book of Enoch, may hold relevance in understanding the broader context of these phenomena, not as literal explanations, but as part of a much longer human record.
Is there historical significance to this? Yes. Is there multiple events that go back to, I would argue, maybe even before the time of Christ that have documented this in text? Yes.
So what happens when you place all of this side by side? Renaissance paintings, medieval frescoes, ancient historical accounts, religious texts, modern military encounters. What emerges is not a single piece of evidence, but a pattern, a recurring description across time, something in the sky, structured, bounded, interactive, observed. The interpretation changes, the language evolves, but the core idea remains remarkably consistent, which leads to a hypothesis, not a conclusion, not proof, but a possibility that this is not a series of unrelated events, but a single phenomenon, seen through different lenses, in antiquity interpreted as divine, in the Renaissance rendered as symbolic but structured, and today described in technological terms, objects, craft, unidentified aerial phenomena. If that is true, then the question is no longer whether these things exist. It is how long they have been here, and how many times humanity has tried and failed to fully understand what it was seeing. Because the sky has not changed, only the way we describe it has, and we have a growing realization that the line between the ancient and the modern may not be a break in the story at all, but a continuation, the same shapes, the same presence, seen through different eyes, described in different words, and still not fully explained, which leaves us with a possibility that is far more unsettling than any single sighting. Not that something arrived recently, but that something has been here long enough for us to have drawn it, and long enough for us to still be trying to understand what we were looking at.